Okay. And I thought I would first start by just introducing briefly Erin and Carey, and then let them, one then the other, however, tell their story. That's kind of how I said it for them. Like, tell your story for a few minutes. Loyola to New York and publishing and editing, and then open up to questions from students, colleagues, whatever, about editing and publishing now, particularly. So first, thank you for all being here. I'm the director of the Center for Editing and Publishing, which is about a year old now. And we have two alumni with us. Kerry Cullen graduated in 2011 and is now this is what I had from the bio from the spring, assistant editor Henry Holt. Is that still accurate?
Yes.
Excellent. And she's also working on a novel. And then Erin Little graduated in 2015 and editorial assistant at Crown, unless that title has changed. Okay. Crown is part of Penguin Random House, by the way. Over the years, things have merged quite a bit. And Erin, by the way, was the first student intern on object lessons that, our colleague Chris co-founded and co-edits.
That's probably why I have my job, honestly.
Well, we'll get into that maybe, right? I mean, I know that story, but I think a lot of people here don't know that story as well. But Carey or Erin, whoever would like to go first and tell us, a bit of your story, and we'd love to hear about it and then do a Q&A at some point.
Carey, do you want to go?
Sure, yeah. So I graduated from Loyola in 2011. While I was there, I majored in creative writing and English literature. John Vigenay was my thesis advisor, and he helped me a lot, was hugely, perhaps even more instrumental than I was when it came to me getting into the Columbia MFA, which is where I went right after Loyola. And then while in the MFA, I started doing an internship at One Story magazine, which is what led me to become more interested in publishing. Also instrumental in me even being interested in that internship was having done the internship class at the New Orleans Review. So that really sort of bridged a burgeoning interest in publishing. And then while I was working for One Story, I got connected a little bit to the agent world. They host a lot of agent panels, so I started learning about what it meant to be an agent. I moved into assisting a literary agent for a year and then jumped over into editorial after about a year of working at a literary agency. So I've kind of been all around the publishing world. I also book sold for a little while I was working at One Story, and was a publicity and communications assistant at the Children's Book Council back when I was still trying to figure out whether I wanted to be working with children's and young adult or adult literary fiction. I've been at Henry Holt as an editorial assistant and then an assistant editor for 5 years now. I acquired my first book there 2 years ago, and it got published this summer. It's called Want by Lynn Stager Strong. It's like the most exciting thing I've ever done, so that's cool. And then while I've been working on my publishing career and sort of moving into doing more acquiring, I have also been working on my novel for the past 6 years, and I think we're going to maybe take it on submission sometime in the next year or so. We'll see. So hopefully I will soon be an editor and a working on getting published author as well. Over to you, Erin.
That's great. I mean, that gives us a lot of things right away. Agent, editor, bookseller. That's good. Thank you. Thank you, Carey.
Yeah, I didn't know that about you working at an agency. That's cool. So yeah, I guess mine is a little different. Like Mark said, I was the first student who acted as like an editorial assistant for Chris and Ian Bogost and their series Object Lessons. And that was really a cool experience because I was still a student, but I really got the kind of experience that you get in a real publishing internship. reading submissions, dealing with correspondence, dealing with authors, fielding queries, like all that kind of stuff. I got a lot of experience with early on. And gosh, I was trying to remember this the other day, and it's like hard to even remember, but I think I did object lessons for like 2 years. And then prior to that, I had helped Chris with his other book projects. So The End of Airports, Deconstructing Brad Pitt, which is like one of my favorite projects that he did. And, you know, I just have a lot of fun memories of like, Chris was renovating his house and Laura was having a baby and he was working on the book. And so we would meet like early in the morning at PJ's, like on Maple Street, and just like, you know, just bang stuff out. So that was a lot of the experience I got at school, which was really cool. And it was a really crazy year for me, the year I graduated. I graduated and I applied to a bunch of internships, publishing internships. And of course, I was still in New Orleans, and I was applying to places in New York. So I kind of felt like I didn't have that much of a chance, to be honest. I was a little bit intimidated by it. But another former professor of mine swooped in right before I interviewed for an internship at Columbia University Press. So like different from what Carey did. Carey went to the school. There's a press like that is associated with the school. So I applied for that internship, and it turned out like, this is just crazy. I mean, it turned out that the editor that I ended up working for published Laura Murphy's books. So Dr. Murphy, I've taken Dr. Murphy before, and we have a really good relationship. And so she, out of nowhere, swooped in and told me in an email, you know, I was contacted by so-and-so about this internship, and I gave you an amazing recommendation. So that's just to say that, like, literally Loyola is everything. So I got that internship. I moved here. I had to live with my aunt and uncle in the suburbs because obviously they don't pay you. So that was really crazy. I did that for 4 months in the fall. And then right as that ended, I was applying for jobs, editorial assistant jobs, and I got one in an academic publishing environment. So very different from what Carey and I both do now. Academic is a lot more volume based. It's a lot more geared at libraries and geared at, you know, like educational platforms, not really commercial. So, but I did that. I was doing literature specific monographs. So a lot of professors, when they wanted to publish their dissertation, would come to us, and that company is called Routledge, which I read a ton of when I was in school because they publish a lot of humanities stuff. So I was there for a year and a half or so, and I just, you know, kind of, I don't want to say I hated it, but I really wanted something different. And so I went on like a month or 2 month long networking binge. I mean, this is literally what I did. Like, I just like found people on LinkedIn. I went through, you know, people I already knew in the city, and just to find people who worked at Penguin Random House, because that's where I wanted to be. And so, I mean, we're talking like tons and tons of like coffees and just meetups. And so I finally met up with a woman who was formerly an assistant editor at Knopf, and she was just like, we clicked really well. And so she ended up being the person who sort of put my resume and cover letter in front of the right person. And that is how I ended up getting called back to interview for my current job at Crown. And yeah, I've been there just over 3 years. Yeah.
Thank you, Erin. I guess something that occurs to me right away is the networking aspect. I mean, at Loyola, but then in New York, and sometimes I know undergrads hear this, and I heard this when I was, doing graduate school a long time ago. But there's kind of this setup or dichotomy for creative writers: New York versus MFA, right? Should I do one or the other? Or should I do like Carey did, and some of our students are thinking about, do my MFA in New York? I mean, does that come up in your minds at all? Is that useful, like for undergrads? Should they be thinking about that choice?
Yeah, I think it is useful, and I think it mostly depends when looking at the MFA or when looking at how you want your career track as a writer, or as a person who wants to work in publishing, or both. I would say, for one thing, if you want to be a writer and work in publishing, or if you want to just work in publishing, probably New York has a little bit of an edge over MFA there. But also MFA in New York, I can really highly recommend, especially because for me, the people that I met at my MFA, it's actually really funny because when I started going to the MFA, there were all these whispers of like, do you think anybody here doesn't want to be a writer and like secretly wants to be an agent or editor and is just scouting for talent? And I was like, oh, I wonder if any of my classmates like actually want to be agents and editors, and if I should be like trying to impress them. And then I'm the one who ended up doing that. And the novel that got published this year was actually by one of my MFA classmates. And a reason that I had an edge when it came to that book was because I had talked about how much I liked her writing before to the person who ended up being her agent. And a few other like similar connections have come up. None have worked out in quite that fairy tale way, but definitely like I'll see novels getting submitted and be like, oh, I recognize that name. I think they went to Columbia. We should read that one first. Which, is kind of like nepotistically gross, but also helpful. So it's important to know that exists, and also that that the connections that you make early on can definitely end up becoming important in your publishing life years and years later. And also that people who work in publishing are paying attention to who's doing good writing very, very early on. Like I have a list that I keep of just like short stories that I've read in the past 5 to 10 years and really loved, and keep watching those writers. That said, when it comes to the MFA in New York, I do think it can also be really distracting to be in that city while you're trying to write. And I think there's also a really good case to be made for getting an MFA in a place where the culture of publishing is not steeping in every single thing that you're doing. I think it might be better for the writer brain and like any kind of self-protective aspects to get your MFA in the most remote place possible so that you're really just focused on the story that you're trying to write. I went to Parnassus Books in Nashville a couple of years ago with the express intent of meeting Ann Patchett because I love her, and she was there, so I met her and I was super starstruck. And I was going through kind of an existential crisis at the time, and I was like, should I live in New York? And she was like, well, I don't live in New York. And my biggest advice to any writer is to keep as low an overhead as possible. So live in the cheapest possible place where you can just survive and you don't have to pay New York rent and you have tons and tons of time to write. So, I think both are really valid, and it kind of depends on what you want to do with your life.
I guess I kind of took the opposite approach. Like, yeah, just because you mentioned it and because some person knows this, I'm applying to MFAs at the end of this year. Multiple people know that, but just for the room, I'm doing that, and I guess I was sort of the opposite. Like Carey went into MFA pretty quickly after graduation, and I feel like I kind of had a point to prove, and that was that you don't have to leave the English major and go teach high school. Like you don't have to leave the English major and do any of these sort of like, I don't know, stereotypical things that people say that English majors do. And I had a really good, wealth of experience from Loyola. So I kind of went straight into like, I'm gonna find this career. And so, yeah, I mean, so for me, like the New York was obvious. It was just, that's where everything is. But I also have been like super, like thankful that I even know Carey, because like I'm now like dealing with all these questions that we're talking about. Like, do I stay in New York? Do I go somewhere else? Do I go somewhere where I don't have to pay that much? Like, that's all happening for me now. So it's a little bit of a flip-flop. But that's why I love being connected still to not only my professors, but people like Carey, people like Adam Ganussi, who had a successful, career in MFA. So, yeah.
One thing I really like hearing from you both is just reflecting on really just like the big picture, the kind of like holistic takeaways of getting the English major, but that it, on some level it doesn't matter if you did the writing track or the film and digital media track or the literature track. What really matters is just the wealth of experiences you get, the connections you make between things. I mean, Carey, I remember you were one of the most memorable students from the first class I ever taught here at Loyola in 2009, and that was a critical theory class. And then to see you, just to see you like fold all of your experiences from Loyola and beyond into what you're doing now. And then Erin, to see you doing that in your own way, but just that, that all of these can kind of work together. They're not just like totally separate and discrete strands that if you don't like follow through with one to the end, then you've like failed, but they all kind of work together.
I feel like I've been thinking about that a lot lately, especially as I watch, I think we're just in a time of change in publishing, and watching people decide to move to different cities or try to figure out how to cobble together their careers in slightly different ways. I feel like this is a time where a lot of that kind of change is happening, and it's sort of thrown into sharp relief how much the in-between actually maybe matters a little bit more than the time spent on any individual track will deepen your relationship with the thing that you're studying at that moment. But it's the in-between where like the friendships and networking kind of happen and get the chance to take root, and where new ideas can come into a life, for lack of a better description. So yeah, I think something I really didn't appreciate, especially when I was still at Loyola, was how much moving from one thing to another would create something holistic, as opposed to being afraid that if I didn't land in the right thing right away, I was going to like somehow consign myself to a terrible life,
That's an interesting point. That phrase, consign yourself into a terrible life, right? I mean, there's many ways to have a terrible life, right? Usually they're not with books, but
usually not.
Like when I'm thinking about, Erin's making this decision now about the MFA, and Carey came the other direction. I'm also thinking about something that one of my mentors said years ago when I was, first becoming a poet. And that was, whatever choice you're making, like city to live in, job to take, career path, the question you probably have to ask yourself, if poetry is your thing, or if, let's say, writing fiction is your thing, is how is that decision going to affect my ability to write poems? So like if I'm thinking about Erin, at some point, right, if you're doing an MFA in prose, I guess, it would be, well, staying in New York, how will that affect my ability to write prose? Or moving to Montana to their, esteemed MFA program, or going back to somewhere where I have family. I mean, how is it all going to affect that central question? And I guess one of my questions for you, Carey, I guess is making books, do you feel like that's your main focus right now? I mean, you're working on a novel. Would you rather be? I'm just curious, because I know a lot of editors over years, and I've had teachers who start out in editing, like Randall Keenan, start out at Random House, as an editor, but at night he'd write from 2 to 5 in the morning and just sleep like 3 hours because he wanted to be a novelist, but it also helped him to get the other side of it, of course. Is that, what's like, do you have a goal? Is that an inappropriate question? I don't know.
No, this is actually a question that I'm particularly welcoming right now because I've been thinking about this a lot. I so far have managed to be able to balance writing and editing in that writing. I've had an easy time remembering that writing is what I consider to be my calling and editing is my job that I love. I will say that as I proceed further down an editorial career, it does become harder to balance because you, especially when you're a writer, you know what it means to be an author and you know how much writers want to be able to trust that their editors prioritize them. And so emotionally it gets a little bit more difficult. Like when you're mostly doing assistant stuff, it's like, well, these aren't my authors. There is somebody else who's in charge of making sure that their books go to print, and like I'm not the person that they're depending on to make sure that their like baby gets out into the world. But when I have my own authors, it is a little bit harder to feel like I should be prioritizing my own writing. That's something I've actually been thinking about a lot. I think probably there will be a point when I'm prioritizing my own writing, and I'm not sure exactly what that will look like. I've thought about maybe eventually moving into a space where I'm in publishing, but in a different way, whether it's like working for a literary magazine or a small press, just something that's a little bit less volume than a big trade publishing house. But I wouldn't want to move out of this section of publishing that I'm in right now before I feel like I've learned everything that I can learn, and I'm definitely still learning. So, you know, it's something that I'm just kind of trying to move with and trying to be as intentional as I can about the responsibilities that I've sort of found myself with, and holding those carefully while also considering that I still think that I'm more of a novelist than an editor at heart.
That's fair. Erin, is it, my question was earlier about whether Carey had you know, always wanted to be a, you know, obviously as a writer, but like now she's an editor, so that's kind of taking the more of the frame. Was yours, you know, you wanted a career at first, but yeah, was the goal of the career to become, you know, more of a writer?
Yeah, I think for me, I always knew that I wanted to go back to school. And I kind of always knew it would be for an MFA. I'd kick around the idea of an MA every now and then, but I think in the back of my mind, I always knew that. But honestly, Mark, like you were one of the people that inspired me because you waited a while. Like you waited a while to go back to grad school. And I don't know if it was during a class or something, but I just remember you telling us about that and like explaining how like, you know, it's always up to you, but by letting yourself live a couple of years and be in the world and have a job and go through life first, it can do a big service to your writing. So that's kind of how I looked at it. You know, I was always one of the youngest people in my grade. And so for me, you know, I graduated and it's like, I'm 22, you know, I don't really feel like a writing program is where I need to be now. Like I want, and you know, now I'm 27. So it's like, there's a big difference, you know, there's a big world of difference. And I feel like now as I approach 30, like the writing is more, it's becoming more important to me. It's like, okay, now I've been out here, I've done this career for almost 4 years. Not like I'm so excited to leave it or anything, but it does kind of remind me of what I want to do with my own like writing, you know. I mean, for example, a couple of months ago, still during quarantine, an editor who Carey knows, Libby Burton, who, this is just like, life is hilarious. Like, so.
Libby was my old boss and like a big mentor to me for about 3 years at Holt.
And now she's a Crown. Woohoo!
Yeah.
So it's like, you know, it's such a small world. It's weird. But she got a submission in a couple months ago, and it was for a poetry anthology, and it was for like poems specifically written in or about quarantine. And
Got that one in.
I was obsessed with it. I was like, oh my God, like it's a who's who of poets here. Like they're so amazing. I remember reading the submission and going nuts over it. And of course, you know, we didn't move forward with it because haha, poetry is the hardest thing to sell ever. Ha ha. But like, whatever, like I don't care. I was super inspired by that. And that's like one of the examples of like a time where I'm looking at a submission and I'm like, like, let me look at this as an editor. But when I'm looking at, you know, the who's who of poets in 2020, it's like, wait, like, I want to be doing that. Like, I want my brain to be on that, you know? So it is a little bit of a balancing act, you know? And right now I feel extremely like, kind of, like I'm on a seesaw because I spend most of my day 9 to 5, you know, doing my job, but, you know, putting together materials for your applications is a whole other job. Like it's just so much. So I kind of feel like I'm burning the candle at both ends in that sense.
That's
You know, the
great.
great German writer Goethe said that a publisher would rather find a thief in his office than a poet.
Yeah, you can't trust the poets. So I want to open up for questions that anyone might have, especially, you know, our students who, you know, are maybe on this journey, whether it's to New York or to just graduating and figure out what they want to do next. So questions for Erin or Carey? I don't want to manipulate or monopolize my questions.
We also had, like, I don't know if Carey did this, but I pulled just like 2 quick things for like a show and tell, if anybody's interested. Carey, I like, at the beginning of this, I really wanted to be like, Carey, what's up with Mariah? Like, let me know what's going on. Because Holt just published Mariah Carey and Crown is about to publish Matthew McConaughey. So it's like all very,
I mean, I actually think it's important to mention that, like, I did not ever think that I would be working on my Mariah Carey's autobiography, and it's been fun. I'm the assistant on it. I'm not the editor on it. But it's been an example of how you can enter into a publishing career and think that you're headed down one path and find out that you are getting kind of moved around to different paths, and that can come with some really cool stuff. And I think for some people, like actually for the current editor of the Mariah Carey autobiography, who was not the person who acquired it, it was like this amazing gift that landed in his lap. And then for me, it's kind of like, I don't really care about celebrities. Like talking about how many Instagram followers the person who retweeted the picture of the book has is like not what I wanted to be doing with my life. But for me, it allows me to then like spend the rest of my time working on literary fiction and like quieter literary fiction that maybe won't sell hundreds of thousands of copies. And because I'm also being used to like aggregate all of these Instagram statistics at the same time, I don't have to worry that I'll lose my job over the literary fiction that doesn't sell tons of copies. So you end up like making these compromises that, I don't know, to me, it just continues to be really interesting, all the different ways that a publishing career can go, from like strictly editorially, how you can end up working on things that feel just completely disparate to each other, because like one thing will balance out the other thing, or even just in the grander scheme, how you could go into publishing thinking that you're going to be an editor and find out that the job book scout exists, which I didn't even know when I started working in publishing, which is mostly like when your entire job is basically to keep abreast of what is selling in different countries and pitch books that have sold really well in one country to another country. So the whole job is reading, which a couple of my friends ended up going into and they just love it. Anyway, whole point being that like the Mariah Carey thing has been a wild trip and I feel lucky to be working on it, but I also kind of wish that somebody else who felt luckier got to work on it.
Yeah, I myself, like, as someone who's from Texas and who's obsessed with Maggie McConaughey, I personally feel very special to work on this book.
That's amazing.
I mean, yeah, but it's just funny because like at the office, like, I don't know, I just feel like a couple of us that are from Texas were always the ones who freaked out the most. But yeah, I see what you're saying, because I mean, Crown has done a lot of celebrity books, and okay, well, yeah, so I'll put right here in the, I was gonna share it on the chat, but I don't even know if I know how to do that. I'll share my screen because I just pulled up the, I have some book covers I can show y'all. How do I do this? How do I share my screen? Oh, here we go. Okay, desktop. All right, so this is the Green Lights cover. Mr. Matthew. And I actually just like quickly want to say that this is kind of unlike any other celebrity book I've even touched, because Matthew wrote this book. Like, he actually wrote this book. So, I mean, you know, there's lots of ghostwriters and collaborators that float around in publishing, but he was very serious about writing it himself. So I think that's really cool. So that's one thing. And then the other kind of book that I work on a lot is sort of this nexus of current events and like business, tech, like it's all nonfiction. But this is a really cool book by a British economist about the loneliness epidemic. And what's wild is that we acquired this book and edited it and did everything for it prior to Corona. So this was all pre-Corona, and it was supposed to come out way sooner than it is now, because the author wanted to go back and include, you know, quarantine and isolation and all those types of themes in the book. So, but now it's like, so that's like another kind of example of like a little bit of a stressful situation with a book. Like if an author has finished the manuscript, but then, you know, current events, you know, pan out a certain way. I've seen this a lot of times where authors want to continually update the book. They just want to like, they want it to be like a living text. And that's something that usually the editor, but sometimes as the assistant, you know, you have to rein it in, because luckily, like, we dealt with this one, but it was looking like we were just going to lose our pub date. And so that's just another example of the kind of trade-offs that you have to make. It's a lot of dealing with people, like it really is. And of course now we're not in person, so that's a little bit weird. But yeah, I guess, yeah, okay, I'll stop now. I guess that my point is just that like so much of this job is actually just about dealing with people.
In the chat, Ashley had asked, I don't know if y'all can see the chat, she had asked about what it was like to get in Columbia to graduate school.
Yeah, well, again, I was so lucky in that John here helped me so much. Worked with me on my personal statement, on my portfolio, was truly like one of the most amazing mentors I've had in my life during my senior year at Loyola, and that helped a lot. I can't really objectively say how hard it is to get in. I know that it is kind of a funny thing, and I bet there's even more information shared now with social media being just like more prevalent now about how when applying for the MFA, like everybody has these wish lists, and like for me, for example, I applied to 11 schools and the only one I got into was Columbia. And it was also kind of like hilarious because I had been a little bit disorganized about like the actual nuts and bolts application process, was like submitting things on like the last possible minute. With Columbia specifically, I was writing an essay while on a road trip that I sent in at 11:56 p.m. with all my friends sitting around in a room, like, are you done yet? Like on the day it was due. And so I wasn't getting into any of these schools, and I kept like telling my friends at the time, like, oh, I've really learned my lesson. I need to be a more organized person. And then I realized I had a voicemail that I hadn't listened to for like 2 weeks, and it was the school calling to tell me I'd gotten in. Which is all to say that like I have my story about how I didn't get into 10 schools, but I got into Columbia. There are so many people who have their stories about how they didn't get into 10 schools, but they got into Brown. So many where they didn't get into 10 schools, and then they went and did something else for a year, applied again, and got into 8 of them. Like, I think the lesson when it comes to grad school applications that I learned, which is very similar when it comes to submitting stories for Lit Mags, I've also learned is like, just to keep trying, and especially not to like keep trying, make sure that you're considering all of your options, and don't feel like if you do get rejected, it says anything at all about who you are as a writer, because it really doesn't. Oftentimes it's perseverance that actually gets you the thing. And I feel I'm going to look at the second part of the question. Yeah, so the application process, I would say the only big surprise is that you have to write an essay along with your portfolio for Columbia, which you don't have to do for anything else.
I'm not applying there because I don't want to do that.
That's the thing that I did while on the road trip, because I didn't even see that part of the application until it came up. I would
Also
not recommend
asking
doing that.
She's also asking about aid.
Yes.
Financial aid.
So I didn't get any financial aid. I took it all out in student loans. I would not recommend doing that if you can help it. Some people do get aid. Some people get full rides. It's really kind of just the luck of the draw. I would say if you're planning on applying to Columbia, apply there, definitely. Also apply to a bunch of other places that do offer full aid. And if nothing else, if you get into both, then maybe, but your heart is set on Columbia, maybe you can use the other offer to leverage and get more aid out of Columbia.
Can I add one more detail to Carrie's story? She was in a writing workshop with me when she checked her voicemails. And she looked up and said, I just got a voice message from Columbia. What should I do? And I said, you should go out in the hall, call them back and say yes. And that's just what she did. And
I'm so happy that I did.
Yeah.
Oh, I love that.
Can I add something else about Carrie's comments? We've had a lot of students who've applied to a dozen schools and gotten accepted by the best one and got turned down by much lesser ranked schools after that. So if you're thinking about an MFA, it's absolutely critical to apply to a large group of schools, because it can be that you're a poet, and last year they accepted 12 poets and 1 fiction writer. So this year they're going to accept nothing but fiction writers.
Yeah.
And therefore you really have to throw a very wide net, and your professors can be very helpful in giving you some guidance about the quality of an MFA program at this particular moment versus its old reputation. And of course you've got alumni who will very generously give you guidance too about where programs are right now.
I see Buddig Hall over here. Hi. I just see where I lived for 2 years.
Skylar, you have a question?
Yes, and also I wanted to say that just leaping off of that, so I just got accepted to Carnegie Mellon, not for an MFA, but for whole studies, but the same thing happened. I was rejected by 2 schools recently, but like I got rejected by UC Santa Cruz, like literally like 2 weeks before, and I got like invited to this like Zoom meeting by Carnegie Mellon. I was like, I'm not gonna get into there, but I was like, whatever, let me like go to this Zoom meeting. And I ended up like really liking the program, and I was like, whatever, I'll just apply. And I just like wrote out this thing, and I was like, you know what, like since I'm not gonna get in, like let me tell them like I'll tell them what I actually want to study. And like a week later, they accepted me. So
I love that. Congratulations.
thank you. But I was like, I got like rejected. Well, I got rejected by like Berkeley's like PhD program. So like that's like Cruise and like versus like Carnegie and some other stuff.
What field was that? You cut out when I didn't hear the field. What?
Oh, literary and cultural studies.
Oh, got it. Excellent.
Yeah. So, and like I have my MPH, so like I'm planning on going to, I want to do like how we study public health topics in literature and film and all that jazz.
Amazing.
Yeah, so I'm still interested in like publishing, and one of the questions I wanted to ask is, so like right when I got out of Loyola, I was offered this position that was like completely unpaid and it was like 40 hours a week, but like I didn't take it. So when you're getting into this field, do you think that it's necessary for you to take something that's unpaid? Is that something that's evil? Because like when I look back at when I was offered that position, but like I didn't take it because it was unpaid, and I just couldn't because I needed money at the time. But I was like, oh, I was offered this thing at this like publishing company. I like kind of regret it because that could have been my foot in the door to publishing, because like that's something that I'd been interested in, you know, since I was at Loyola. So is that like something that's necessary to get your foot in the door, to do something that's unpaid, or what?
I think it's a super interesting question, and the reason I'm jumping to answer it is because during the pandemic, we have been having a lot of conversations, I know at Crown and I know at the corporate level of Penguin Random House, about the disparity in not only just, you know, working something that's unpaid, but in the amount that entry-level employees get paid, because you know, something that came out of one of these sort of team huddles that we had over Zoom with a bunch of the assistants was that a lot of us have second jobs. Like, I don't personally, I mean, I used to like do like, you know, like side hustle type stuff. Like I would sell clothes or, you know, that kind of thing. But a lot of people actually have a second job, and it's because even when you make it to that level of being an employee, a lot of times the money's not enough. And so with regard to internships, I know that it's kind of like a double-sided coin. It's like the reality is that a lot of them are unpaid. Columbia actually just changed, like I was the last person under their prior rules where like they didn't pay, and now their rule is that they only accept Columbia undergrads into that internship and they pay them. But that's like, you know, kind of, it's kind of attached to the school. So that's why they're able to pay them. But I guess I would say that when I was starting out, yes, like when I was starting out, I think it was absolutely like a big deal to, or maybe not necessary, but something that you would want to do to work a position like that, even if it's not paid. But I do feel like right now, especially sparked by the pandemic, sparked by, you know, all the problems with equity and inclusion in publishing, there's a lot of conversations going on right now about how to change that, because it's not right. And you know, there's been this huge reckoning about just like the entrenched whiteness of publishing. Like that's something that for me, I've been, you know, it's something that you kind of struggle with, because you're like, okay, I made it all the way here, I should be proud of myself. But like we work in an industry that is absolutely dominated by whiteness. So, you know, one of the things that I appreciate about at least my imprint is that we're having these conversations about what blocks the rest of the world from, you know, getting into publishing. And a lot of it is economics. Like a lot of it is money. A lot of it is where you're from, where you live. And so, yeah, I think that the reality is that you'll see a lot of people get their foot in the door via a free position, or not free position, but like a working for free position. That doesn't mean that it's right. And that doesn't mean that you have to do it. And I don't think you should regret not doing it.
Yeah, I agree with Erin there. And I would also second that these conversations are happening, and I think things are changing pretty quickly. I know at least my company, which is an imprint of Macmillan, all of Macmillan just raised their starting salaries. I've heard the PRH is about to do the same. I know a couple of other presses are also raising their salaries. And I think that move will echo throughout the industry, so that ideally there won't be unpaid internships anymore, certainly not unpaid positions. I did take one myself. It started out being for MFA credit, which was great. And then I was unpaid for about a year, and then they ended up deciding to give me a stipend. And for me, I don't have any regrets about that, because it ended up being the foundation of the most important community to me. And it ended up being the people, it was at One Story magazine, and it ended up being the people who helped me find a position as an agent, and later helped me find my own literary agent, and really connected me to the publishing world. I would say that the only reason that that decision was made worth it was because they were giving me something that was of value in a way that would echo throughout my career and help me, and like even, you know, indirectly help me monetarily. I would not say it would have been worth it to take on an unpaid position if I wasn't promised that I would be given not only skills, but community, networking, connections, like very, very blatant connections in return. So that's my personal story on it, and understanding of what is worth it when it comes to unpaid positions. But again, I do think that publishing is going through a much needed reckoning when it comes to whiteness, when it comes to other kinds of diversity as well, when it comes to like opening their doors to people from lower income backgrounds. I think overall we're going to see things change a lot, and that's a really good thing. But again, yeah, I wouldn't regret not taking something unpaid, especially if they didn't give some kind of indication that they were going to like pay you in network, you know.
Oh yeah, it was 40 hours a week too. I'll never forget that email.
Yeah, that's too much. Then you can't even like have a part-time job to live on.
Yeah.
I also had another, which I don't know if this, and this is just coming from like my science side. I wondered if either of you had any experience of like the intersection between like research and publishing, or whether it's like literary criticism, or even like the kind of in between like, I don't know, publishing in like the kind of like journal realm, because I'm kind of in that kind with like, because I'm like in like, I have like my master's of like public health. So I'm still in that like in between of like that kind of like publishing realm. So I'm not sure if either of you have any kind of experience in that. And then also with like the field that I'm trying to go into, I'm also interested in like literary like criticism. So like things that I might want to either publish myself, or if I were to get into like a publishing position myself, that might be like the kind of content that I'd want to publish. I don't know if either of you have any kind of experience in that kind of like.
I wish I did, but I absolutely don't. But maybe Erin can speak to it a little bit.
Yeah. Just going off of the time that I spent, and this actually includes my time with like object lessons and Chris, because we went to the MLA, you know, expo in Vancouver when my senior year. So I was meeting those types of people early on. I guess what I would say about journal publications, you know, if you are writing stuff that you think, you know, could be published in, you know, peer-reviewed journals, that is great. And I would generally say that, like, back at Routledge, like when we were looking at, you know, acquiring a book, I mean, it was very different, like, just disclaimer, like extremely different from trade, but something that we would look for would be, you know, journal publications, like what kind of research background an author has, like that. Those are totally things that are more on the academic side. You know, for example, like I remember one of my first books I did with Routledge, it was a literature monograph, but it had like a child psychology element, and it used like the Peter Pan story as a lens for a lot of different things in child psychology. And the author had like a robust background in both literature and psych, and had published, you know, journal articles like on both topics. And so at that point you become kind of like, I don't know, known in your field. All of this is to say that I mean, if you see things that you think, you know, that you think deserve an essay or an article, like I would say write those things and, like, you know, and send them out. Like I remember at the end of my senior year, I wrote some paper, I think it was for Laura Murphy. I wrote a paper on the queer Dominican diaspora, because we had read The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, and like Brian Sullivan from the library at Loyola told me, he like came up to me with this like this call for papers for some conference, and he was like, Erin, like you should submit, like you should do, you know. And I didn't do it at the time, but like perhaps, you know, if I had done that, like I would have kept doing stuff like that. But those are the types of things, like if you want to work toward like an academic book, like definitely, even more so than like a trade book, like previous publications, I would say are pretty important. So go for it.
Good, thank you, Erin. It makes me think, we've been talking about, you know, individual relationships. I mean, so what we're doing right now, some of the undergrads are getting a sense of how this works. This is what you do. You talk to people, professors or editors, or editorial assistants in different areas. So the fact that you're doing this now is what you need to do more if you're interested in this kind of thing. Chris had in the chat, maybe we can end on this, formally end, you know, the recording, but he asks, you know, what's one concrete piece of advice you love Loyola students who may have an interest in pursuing position and in publishing, right? What's one, you know, your best piece of advice kind of thing? It's one of those kind of questions that's impossible, and yet, you know, something tangible is nice to have it to take away.
I will say there's a lot of advice about networking, but I feel like we've covered networking a good bit. I think what is even more crucial if you want a career in editing is to start honing your taste as quickly as you possibly can. So start really thinking about what kinds of books you love and why you love them and how to talk about why you love them. So much of an editorial career is convincing other people to read the books that you love. And like, you can start doing that right now. You can like have a book that you love and explain to all your friends why they should read it. And when they read it, pay attention to whether or not they agree with you and what they think. If there's something that like they found really interesting that you didn't notice, then like start to get better at noticing those things. I think honing your literary taste is what will make you stand out in publishing, and it's what allows you to be the kind of editor who is really truly doing it for the love of books. And you can start doing that like right this second, which is great.
Oh man, that was good. Yeah, I agree. I think, like, I feel like I know that's really good advice because I feel like I've lived that advice. Like, for a long time, people at my job, like, I don't know, there was just this idea that I wanted to work in fiction more than nonfiction. And like, I mean, I don't know how that was. It's probably just because I enjoy reading a lot of fiction. And if you're asking me about books, I'll probably tell you about a novel, or I'll probably tell you about a poetry collection. But I would just echo that and also say that the nonfiction and fiction marketplaces are very different. So, you know, as somebody who I feel like has an interest in both, it can kind of work against you. Like, you kind of need to pick one. Like, and I've been told that multiple times. I mean, like, the woman who used to be my publisher even was like, you know, Erin, like, you need to figure out like what it is that you really are trying to do, like, book wise. So, and now, you know, I'm fully in a nonfiction program, and like, that's where my like knowledge comes from. That's where all of my work is. You know, Carey's very different, and I don't know a lot about that fiction marketplace. But if you're a person who is super like excited about memoir or biography, or, you know, like deeply reported narrative fiction, like, or narrative nonfiction, I mean, like, those are really good things to know, just personally. And another good piece of advice I've gotten from people I work with is that you can love to read something and love to work on something completely different. And you know, that's kind of how I found it. Like, I read more fiction than I do nonfiction, you know, like, honestly, but I like a lot of the nonfiction like workflow better. You're dealing with a lot of original research, you're dealing with a lot of journalists, and I think those people are super interesting. But I went into this with kind of a like, oh, I want to do everything, haha, and it's like, they're really looking for you to be focused. So take this time, I guess, like, while you're still in school, or you know, before you go out to look for a job, like, take the time to really decide, like, do I want to be a novel editor? And being that, you know, this is something that Carey definitely knows more than I do. That means that you're reading full novels on submission. You know, so like, you're not reading proposals. Like, when I get proposals, they're like 30 pages, 50 pages, sample chapters. When you're doing fiction editorial, you're reading straight books and going from there. So just kind of know that, and like, go into it with like a clear-eyed vision of what you want to work on. They'll like that.
Thank you both. That was great.
Thank you. I'm going to
Thank you
end
so
the
much for having
recording
me.
now, but we can, if you want to talk a little further, or students have some more questions, we can certainly entertain those if you guys have another 10 minutes or so. Okay, cool. Let me stop the recording part.